Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Hello. So in this module, we are looking at translation before Renaissance. By Renaissance, I mean European Renaissance, which began in Italy in the 13th century and then spread to other parts of Europe. So why is this particular time period chosen? Because the Renaissance was the beginning of the modern period, what we call the modern period. So everything that happened before that is pre-modern, according to some sociologists. That's why we have chosen this particular period for a look at the translation activity. So how did it all begin? That's an interesting question. So let's talk about this theory called the theory of proto-language, that all human languages which are currently spoken in the world originated or evolved from this proto-language. So this theory has been proposed by two different groups of people. One, scientists, geneticists, who have analyzed the human genetic makeup and come to the conclusion that all human beings living today are descended from the same group of people who migrated out of Africa some 70,000 to 1 lakh years ago. And the second group of people are, of course, linguists, who have analyzed the languages of the world and come to the same conclusion. And the most important of them, perhaps, is Noam Chomsky, who talked about universal grammar, a grammatical structure which is common to all languages of the world. And the person who is currently most popular in our knowledge about the origin of language in Africa is Spencer Wells, who wrote this very interesting book called The Journey of Man, a Genetic Odyssey. So flashback to Africa, 70,000 to 1 lakh years ago, where a small tribe living near the Kalahari Desert, they are called the San Bushmen, they still live there, their descendants still live there. So they started migrating outward in search of food. It was the beginning of the Ice Age, rainfall was scarce and vegetation was scarce, there were fewer animals to hunt. So it was a migration in search of food. So this migration ultimately ended up by populating the whole world. Okay. The last areas to be populated were the Americas, the Indian tribes who migrated to the Americas across the Bering Strait in Siberia 12 to 15,000 years ago, ultimately filled up the two continents. That is the last big migration. So what was happening during these 70,000 to 1 lakh years? A proto-language which was spoken by the tribe who migrated out of this area near the Kalahari Desert was evolving into different languages. First into language families and then into the individual languages that we know today. So that's why Chomsky said that there is a universal structure, because all languages have ultimately evolved from the same proto-language. In fact, there is a language in the near the Kalahari Desert called Khoisan today, which is considered to be a direct descendant of the language spoken by their ancestors 70,000 to 1 lakh years ago. Right. So we are talking about translation, and I would make this statement, parodying Gramsci, the Italian philosopher, that all human beings are translators, which means all human beings are capable of translating, learning more languages and capable of translating, because ultimately all languages are evolved from the same proto-language and they all carry certain basic traits. So we are talking about humanity's attempt to reunite themselves through translation. The various cultures in the world which attempted this reunification. Let's look at these cultures. But before we look at the cultures, let us try to hypothesize who the first translators were. Who were the first translators? The first translators were probably prisoners of war. Interesting, isn't it? Well, this is how it might have happened. When there is a conflict between two tribes, they fight each other. As happens in all such conflicts, some people are captured as prisoners. So these prisoners then live with their enemies, the enemy tribe, and learn the language of that enemy tribe. So they have two languages now. One, the language which they spoke back home. Now the language they are speaking in captivity in the enemy country, territory. So the captors found a function for these people. They could serve as mediators in communicating with the enemy tribe. Okay, so there might have been thousands of such prisoners of war who would have served as the first known translators. Right. But we have certain knowledge about translation only from about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. By certain knowledge, I mean recorded knowledge. Okay. What these prisoners of war did, those prisoners of war did, was not recorded. But here we have records of the Sumerian cuneiform tablets. I think you all know what they are. Clay tablets on which they wrote various things, okay, in their script, first known script. What was done in Egypt was not, strictly speaking, writing in a script. It was a pictorial script, hieroglyphics. This is actually a proper script, okay, not alphabetic but syllabic, as all Phoenician languages are. The Sumerian language was syllabic. It had actually two forms. Actually, it was split into two languages. The official language was Sumerian, and the colloquial language, the language spoken by the people, was Akkadian. Okay, so these tablets contained inscriptions in these two languages. Okay, so what was the first inscription about? Normally, let us say, government proclamations, official proclamations by the emperor. Okay, various bits of information for the people, and of course accounts. So probably the first translator was an accountant, the last person we think of as a translator today. But it's of course a fact. One of the first translators definitely was an accountant who wrote accounts of the grains, for example, distributed to the people, or stored in granaries, the kingdom's granaries. Right. So that was the first recorded instance of translation. But translation on any systematic scale happened a little later. But before we come to that, we come to the systematic practice of translation just a few minutes from now. But before that, let's look at the African tradition, because that's another evidence that we have, because we have had information from the practice of African tribes, especially from colonial historians, okay, and anthropologists. So it appears that in Africa, pre-colonial Africa, there were thousands of languages spoken by scattered tribes, okay, belonging to different language families. In fact, each tribe would have had its own language. So every tribe Apart from a shaman, you know who a shaman is, a wizard, okay, a man who works miracles, okay, one who cures diseases by magic man. So the shaman was an institution, but another institution was that of the linguist. A person proficient, so-called pandit, we call such a person a pandit, proficient in language, who can make proclamations, who can perhaps narrate stories, write poems. Okay. So such linguists existed in every tribe, and they had, it appears, knowledge of other languages as well. Okay, languages of neighboring tribes, for instance. So they uh, also, like the prisoners of war, might have served as mediators between tribes. Okay, and we know of these people who are called griots, griots, of West Africa. They were storytellers and minstrels. There are records of such griots. Okay, if you read accounts of French historian, for example, you will find that the griots occupied an important, of course they might still be around, but not as prominent as they were. So at that time, in pre-colonial Africa, the West Africa, the griots occupied an important position in their tribes. They were also translators. That's the point. But the first systematic practice of translation happens in ancient Rome. Okay, from, let us say, the 2nd century BCE. So the Roman civilization, as we know, modeled itself upon classical Greek civilization, both the Hellenic and the Hellenistic civilization. The Hellenistic civilization of the Macedonian Alexander, and the pre-Hellenistic civilization of people like Socrates, Socratean philosophers, writers. So the Roman civilization, in fact, borrowed everything, nearly everything, from Greeks. So they translated on a large scale. They translated works on philosophy, works on science, works on a number of other branches of knowledge, on mathematics. And they, besides translating literary texts, they adapted Greek texts. Okay, so both phenomena are at work. One, translation; the other, adaptation. And we find that the Romans also began what we call the discipline of translation studies. Okay, it's as a discipline, we know that it's not older than 1972. That's another story. I'll come to that. But in practice, without calling itself translation studies, these Roman writers, philosophers, and rhetoricians, Horace the poet, for example, Quintilian the critic, Cicero the rhetorician, all these people talked about translation because they were seeing it before their own eyes. So they discussed things like whether you should translate word by word, word for word, or whether it should be sense for sense, or whether you should modify your translation, rewrite it, render it, embellish it, whatever you want to do. So I think the general consensus was that one could go for sense translation, but one should not be imitating slavishly. You could think of rewriting the original text, you write the original text. You could think of modifications. You could think of adapting the original text to a new audience. The Romans were an entirely different kind of people from the Greeks. Some would call them more roughshod, coarse. But that is beside the point. I don't want to discuss that. But they were certainly a different people. So it was probably a very welcome idea to adapt those texts, to make necessary changes. Probably this was done by writers, and in full-fledged adaptations, the plays of Seneca, for example, or Terence, they adapted Greek plays and wrote their own plays, but they kept the originals in mind. So that was also happening. And we also find that there was official patronage for translation. Emperor Augustus, for example, in the 1st century BCE, set up a translation office, interestingly, and employed translators. Probably they were translating knowledge texts from Greek mostly. And after the Roman Empire, after Emperor Diocletian adopted Christianity as the state religion, we have translations of the Bible. The first one being by Saint Jerome. This was done from the original Greek. And besides all these translations of knowledge texts, literary texts, translation of scriptures like the Bible, translation was almost an everyday activity in the empire. What schools there were? There were very few schools, nothing like the schools that we have. But for the learners, translation was an everyday activity. It was a way of learning Greek, for example. The method that we today call the grammar translation method probably has its origins in Rome. So the learners were given translation exercises. Okay, first of such recorded activities in the ancient world. Okay, now let's move on to what happened in India during this time. Not exactly during that, but thereabouts, from the 1st century BC to the 4th or 5th century CE, Common Era. Of course, the first major group of texts to be translated were Buddhist texts from Sanskrit into Pali, which was a form of Prakrit. There were other forms of Prakrit, the colloquial languages of the people, and Buddhist texts were translated into Prakrit, various dialects of Prakrit. And there were Buddhist monks who supervised these translations. In fact, we have a full-fledged translation center at the University of Nalanda, one of India's ancient universities, in what is today Bihar. So it was both a center for Buddhist learning and for translation, of course, chiefly of Buddhist scriptures. And they were translated, interestingly, into Chinese. So the history of translation in China is also linked to Buddhism, of which we'll talk about a little later. Right. So in this center of translation, Buddhist monks were not only engaged in translation, they were also engaged in editing these texts. There was probably a supervisor, a coordinator, and a number of translators, often working in collaboration, right? And this is one kind of translation activity which was happening inside the country. Meanwhile, say at least from the 5th century CE, Indian texts were translated into languages across the border. So we hear of the translation of Panchatantra into Greek or Persian. Aesop's fables, well known all over the world. They are supposed to be adaptations of our Panchatantra tales. Okay. And a little later, let us say starting from the 8th to 10th centuries, works from Sanskrit were translated into India's emerging regional languages. Of course, they were translated into Tamil a little early. Tamil is also a classical language like Sanskrit. And you have texts from the early centuries of the Common Era. Okay. In fact, the Sangam literature in Tamil, like the Romans modeling their literature on classical Greek literature, Tamil Sangam literature modeled itself on classical Sanskrit literature. Their epics are similar, their aesthetics is similar. So that happened a little earlier, but a little later, say 8th to 10th century CE, works began to be translated into India's regional languages. And still later, you find that there are translations of epics like Ramayana in various Indian languages. Tulsidas Ramayana, Narsi Mehta's Ramayana in Gujarati, Eruthachan's Ramayana, Kamba's Ramayana in Tamil, a number of, and right up to the end of the Bhakti period. But the most interesting thing, I would say, is that there is no discussion on translation. No full-fledged discussion on translation as we had in Rome. In Rome, we know, they discussed translation profusely. But in India, nobody did. Probably translation was not considered a category in literature or writing. The more common category was adaptation, and which probably needn't be discussed at all. Okay, they were free adapt. Even what we call the translations of the Ramayana are in fact adaptations. A number of changes have been made, even in the very characterization of Rama, Sri Ram. If you take various Bhakti texts, if you take a translation of Ramayana like Eruthachan's Ramayana in Malayalam, Sri Ram is deified, more a god than a human being. We know that Valmiki had written an epic, composed an epic on a Purushottama, the paragon of humanity. But here, in the various medieval translations of Ramayana, Rama is deified. And a number of other, even the storyline is altered in some Ramayana translations. Okay, so adaptation was more common, and translation was not discussed at all. So people who have tried to formulate an Indian theory of translation, like Ayyappa Panikar, for example, they have done this by taking recourse to reference to various isolated references, mentioning things like Anukriti, Bhavartha, etc., which refer to some kind of adaptation. Even Vivartana is a well-known term for translation, simply means change. So this was there, the impulse to rewrite a text. Okay, so one cannot think of an Indian theory of translation without thinking of this impulse to rewrite, adaptation, right? And moving on to China, across the Himalayas, there, as we know, China had always been a multilingual society for a long time, from the centuries before the Common Era. And they had translation of administrative and commercial material all along during those times. Okay, there were other languages belonging to the same or different families, and China was an empire. It ruled over many different people besides the Han Chinese. So they were the chief population group, but other population groups were also the subjects of the Chinese empire, like exactly like the subjects of the Roman Empire. But when Buddhism arrived in China, the translation activity received a big fillip, so that you find a profuse translation of Buddhist texts from Sanskrit into Chinese, starting from the 1st century BC, going right up to the 5th or 6th century. This activity continues. And in the 4th century, we hear of a Chinese emperor setting up a translation bureau with an Indian as its chief. He was named Kumarajiva. He belonged to Kashmir, and he supervised the work of translators. And the same kind of discussions occurred that we saw in Rome, whether a translation should be word for word, whether it should be sense for sense, whether you were permitted to take liberties. So the situation was slightly different because in Rome, they were translating philosophy, science, and other kinds of knowledge texts. Here, the chief material for translation were Buddhist texts. So the question of faithfulness came in, and most translators were of the opinion that the translation should be faithful. Not only that they should be faithful, sometimes they wrote the original text alongside the translation, so that a reader who knew both languages could verify whether the translation is well done. And in Buddhist viharas in China, as in Nalanda in India, there was a large amount of collaborative translation. Monks, hundreds of monks engaged in translation at the same time. Discussions, verifications, advice from the bureau chief, all these were happening in China. And from the end of the 6th century, we find a lull in translation, but works continued to be translated into and from Chinese. And the next stage we see at the Renaissance, but that's another story. So we move on to the Persian and Arabic tradition. I'm taking these two traditions together, they are connected. So what is happening there? Persians are our neighbors. In fact, the Farsi language, what we today call Farsi, is closely related to the languages of India like Hindi. So in the 6th century, Islam had not yet spread into Persia. There were translations from Greek, Syriac, and Syriac was the original language in which the language in which the Bible was originally composed. Aramaic and Syriac, both languages are taken together. And there were translations in the 6th to 8th century, quite a few. Probably the Panchatantra also arrived in Persia at this time. And then something dramatic happened. Islam arose as a global religion. So within a short time, Islam had spread to as far west as Spain. So by the 9th century, the Islamic empire stretched from Spain to the borders of India. And one of the important preoccupations of the Islamic empire was the acquisition of knowledge through translation. This they did with such fervor that hundreds of translations were produced. They were from Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Syriac, any language which the empire was in contact with. Okay. So our own Varaha Mihira, for example, was translated into Arabic. Okay. And probably Bharata, who wrote Natyashastra. Okay. But if you look at these translations, you notice an interesting thing. They were not interested in literature. They don't have a translation of any of Kalidasa's plays, but they have Viramira. Okay. They have other important philosophers and scientists. Okay, translated from. They didn't translate Sophocles' plays. They didn't translate the Iliad or the Odyssey. So this is a kind of preference that certain cultures have for translations. And as we know, the Islamic empire had different centers. For some time it was based in Spain, for some time in Baghdad, for some time in Damascus. But during all these times, or during these centuries, from the 9th to the 13th, translation was a profuse activity. And it is officially supported. Okay. something else was happening, not happening, something else was visible on the ground. Persian, the old Persian language, it had not disappeared. It continued to exist as a literary language, right? Although Arabic was the official language, Persian was given the status of a literary language. And when the Arabic Empire collapsed or was taken over by the Turks in the Mongols and the Turks in the 13th century, Persian received a regeneration. You have Persian being the official language in a large territory from West Asia to Central Asia to South Asia. Our Sultanate rulers spoke Farsi or Persian. It was the official language in India for a long time, nearly 1,000 years before the British arrived. So, the end of the medieval period saw some translations from Sanskrit also into Persian after the 13th century. And Dara Shikoh, Emperor Aurangzeb's brother, was a big scholar. He knew Sanskrit very fluently. He was an in-depth scholar of Sanskrit, and he translated 50 of our Upanishads into Persian. So this kind of cosmopolitan culture was prevalent in those periods. And not to omit another important aspect of translation, as in the Roman period, adaptations outnumbered translations. Every popular story or poem was adapted. Okay, you have a number of adaptations of Layla Majnu, for example, of a well-known ballad from the classical Arabic culture into a number. Many other narratives, well-known. I've already discussed the Panchatantra tales. So adaptation was very common. It was an age of adaptation, I would say, rather than an age of translation. Now, I think you have noticed that I omitted the Greek tradition. There is a reason. Classical Greek civilization had virtually nothing to do with translation. They considered themselves self-sufficient. Okay. They didn't need translations. They were full of, saturated with knowledge, they thought. So they had, Persians were their neighbors. They fought a long war with the Persians. Okay. But they didn't translate from the Persian language anything, although the Persians did a little later. But we hear of translation into Greek at a different period in history, from the 5th century onwards, when one branch of the Roman Empire had set itself up in the eastern part of Europe. It was called the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. They had translation as an important activity. But interestingly, what they translated were Latin texts, which many of which were translations from Greek. So a kind of back translation. Most of them were about administration and law, right? And the Eastern Roman Empire indulged in another kind of interesting translation activity. It is what we today call intralingual translation within the language. In this case, translation from classical Greek into contemporary colloquial Greek. So the classical Greek was probably incomprehensible to the majority of the population. And for a text like the Bible, they needed colloquial Greek translations. And of course, Homer's epics again. They were translated from classical Greek into contemporary Greek. So here probably one can say is the first organized instance of intra-linguistic translation. We hear about this particular category from Roman Jakobsen's essay published in 1941. That's a different story. We'll come to that a little later. And what was happening in Europe at this time during the medieval period, when the vernaculars, so-called vernaculars, were on the rise. What today are the national languages of Europe. English began its existence in the 5th century. French a little later, Spanish a little later, and all the other languages of Europe, including Russian, following. So by the 10th century of the Common Era, all these languages were in existence. So one of the first translation activities in these languages was the translation of the Bible. Because all of them had been Christianized by this time. By the 6th or 7th century CE, almost all nations of Europe, almost all linguistic communities of Europe had been converted to Christianity. So they needed translations of the Bible and other Christian texts, homilies, other histories of Christian communities. We know that Bishop Bede's History of the Anglo-Saxon People, ecclesiastical history of the Anglo-Saxon people, was written in Latin first and then translated into the Wessex dialect of Old English. So this was one important area of translation. A little later, when these languages matured to produce literature of various kinds, poems, ballads, narratives, there were translations from one European language, modern European language, into another. And as we found with the Arabic Persian translations, many of these translations were overshadowed by adaptations. All the stories that we find, plenty of stories adapted by later day writers like Shakespeare. Shakespeare did not write a single story on his own, single plot on his own. They were all adopted from different sources, mostly from medieval histories and literary cultures, ballads, tales, various kinds of narratives. So this was the kind of activity that prevailed in Europe during the medieval period. Here's your reference for you. Mona Baker, edited, Routledge Encyclopedia of Translation Studies, Routledge 2001. Susan Bassnett, Translation Studies. This is an old book, first published in 1981. This edition is of 2014, also published by Routledge. Then an interesting essay by Ayyappa Panikar, Towards an Indian Theory of Translation. You will find this in a book edited by Tutun Mukherjee, Translation from Periphery to Center Stage, published by Prestige Books in 1998. And finally, a work not on translation but very interestingly related to translation before Renaissance, Spencer Wells's popular book, The Journey of Man, A Genetic Odyssey, published in 2017, Springler Science Library. So we come to the end of this module. Thank you.